This is a further follow-up on the Flint water crisis, and the governor, Rick Snyder, is appearing on the Morning Joe show, and this is when you find out that you're being fed a load of bullshit. I'm going to play the segment from the Morning Joe show, and then I'm going to play a segment from News One, and you're going to see the differences. Now, I don't know how far this goes, but there's corruption, and I'm going to say it point blank. There's corruption going on here, and the focal point, in my opinion, of that corruption is Darnell Earley. So I'm going to play this portion of the Morning Joe show with the governor, and then I'm going to play the segment from News One.
The Environmental Protection Agency said yesterday it had accepted the resignation of Regional Administrator Susan Hedman, who presided over the region that includes Michigan. EPA Chief Gina McCarthy said she accepted Hedman's resignation effective next month to ensure the office remains solely focused on restoring Flint's drinking water. McCarthy also issued an emergency order expanding federal oversight over the cleanup process, citing continuing delays and lack of transparency. Well, one person who's been pretty transparent, joining us now from Ann Arbor, Michigan, is the governor of that state, Rick Snyder. Governor, thank you for being on the show this morning. We have a bunch of really hard questions for you. I'll start with this. Obviously, in 2014, the reporting has been that the GM plant stopped using the Flint water because it was corroding their auto parts. I guess the question everyone's asking is how then would it still be continued to be used in the sinks and pots and pans and water glasses of the people of Flint? And how would you characterize this case? A case of stupidity or corruption? What happened?
Yeah, well, the GM is a different situation. It didn't deal with lead at all. It dealt with chlorine and other questions about their paint process and such. But going to your bigger question, which is the most important question, is there were major failures here. And if you look at it, it was people being much too technical, not having a culture of asking the common sense questions, and then the tone of how things were done. So there are a number of failures there that these people, this was a terrible tragedy. That these people worked for me, and that's why it was important to accept responsibility, and my focus is on fixing this problem, and I've been focused on that very diligently since last October.
So when did you first find out that there was lead in the drinking water in Flint, Michigan?
Yeah, in terms of, that's part of the problem here, is we actually had outside experts raising the question that people in two of our departments didn't see the issue. They actually came back and said, we don't agree with them, we believe we're okay with respect to lead. And when that first came to light that their conclusions were inaccurate, that was actually September 28th and October 1st, one for each of those departments. And we took action on October 2nd in terms of starting to say, don't drink the water, here are free filters, here's activities to help you, please get a blood test, here's water tests. Let's reconnect to the Detroit water system. So we've been pursuing these because it's important we take care of the people of Flint. Damage has been done.
So help us understand this question. So you have two agencies in the state of Michigan designed to protect the environmental health of the people of Michigan, saying nothing to see here, move along. You've got the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. that actually has somebody on their staff that does studies, two studies I believe, that say there's lead in the water. And then the Environmental Protection Agency, regional director, forbids those studies from going public. Why do we now have three environmental agencies basically saying see no evil, hear no evil, do no evil?
Well, it's a huge bureaucratic problem, and it's part of the problem with culture and government. There are a lot of wonnical people in government, and I've been trying to...
you did appoint, though, these two environmental bureaucrats in Michigan, though, didn't you?
Well, let me put it in perspective. They were being... The department people weren't... The heads were not being given the right information by the quote-unquote experts, and I use that word with great trial and tribulation because they were considered experts in terms of their background. These are career civil servants. They had strong science, medical backgrounds in terms of their research, but as a practical matter, when you look at it today and you look at their conclusions, I wouldn't call them experts anymore.
See, now that's a load of bullshit, because it's one thing, and I do have a science background. Science is science. And if someone's coming to you and telling you there's lead in the water, and they have scientific data to support that conclusion, and you disagree with it, the only way that you should be able to disagree with it is if you do your own tests and then can put your tests up against their tests. And if these two bureaucrats did their own tests, there's no way that they could have come up with different conclusions. So he's just he's spreading a load of bullshit as far as that's concerned.
Going forward, Governor, it's Tom Brokaw, going forward, how do you rearrange the state on environmental issues and on health issues so you don't have a repeat of that in other areas, infectious diseases or whatever it happens to be? You need to have a kind of bottom to top up reformation of the early detection procedures and the people who are in charge of that.
Absolutely, Tom. If you look at, I want to bring in third-party experts, because again, this was a violation of the trust of the people of Flint and the people of the state of Michigan. That's a terrible thing. People have been harmed. So this is something that we don't consider just, what one person did. Let's look at the entire cultural background of how people have been operating. Let's get in there and rebuild a culture that understands common sense has to be part of it. Taking care of our citizens needs to be part of it. That's paramount importance when you're talking about the safety of our citizens.
So, Governor, you're shouldering a lot of this, and we've had you on the show a number of times. We think you're a really good man.
I don't.
I'm going to read you from the New York Times this morning. It's pretty searing, and I'd like to ask you to respond. If Flint were rich and mostly white, would Michigan state government have responded more quickly and aggressively to complaints about its lead-polluted water? Is this a case of environmental racism?
And in my opinion, the answer is yes. Because if a bunch of middle-class white people had started making complaints, the email that was released showed that they ignored the people's complaints because they categorized them as constant complainers. They wouldn't have considered white middle class or upper class people complaining about water, given the amount of taxes and political clout that they would garner, as being complainers. So they would have jumped in here a lot faster. But let's continue.
Absolutely not. Flint is a place I've been devoted to helping. If you look at all the work we've done in
That's
Detroit,
a lie.
Several cities, Detroit, Flint, Pontiac, Saginaw, I've made a focused effort since before I started in office to say we need to work hard to help people that have the greatest need. So we've done a lot in terms of programs there to go help the structurally employed get work. In terms of public safety, we've done a lot. Healthy Michigan was a whole Medicaid expansion, and many of those people getting the greatest benefit are people in places like Flint and such, because they deserve better medical care. So many of these things are actions we've taken. What is so frustrating and makes you so angry about this situation is you have a handful of quote-unquote experts that were career civil service people that made terrible decisions, in my view. And we have to live with the consequences with that. They work for me, so I accept that responsibility, and we're going to fix this problem.
Now, let me give you a little history about what happened here and why an emergency manager was assigned to Flint. The state came through and created a bunch of laws which the citizens basically challenged, so they created a new law in order to bring an emergency manager in. And there have been 3 emergency managers over Flint. I'm going to do a separate video on the history of the emergency managers and what they're doing, in particular to a comment he's going to make later about the Detroit school system. But in a nutshell, Flint was doing very well, and they were spending a lot of money in order to bring up the downtown Flint area. They were spending a tremendous amount of money, and they were obviously running in deficits. The city council of Flint, under Mayor, I believe his name is Waller, had put forward a plan in order to bring Flint out of its financial difficulties. That plan was reviewed by the governor, and he decided that the plan was insufficient. So that's when he appointed the emergency manager. What the emergency managers then did was they came in and took a chainsaw to all of the programs in the city of Flint. Now, it came to the water system, and Flint is tied to Detroit, not just because of the water system, but because Detroit was having severe financial problems. A cost analysis was done for switching the water system over from Detroit to the Huron water system. The cost analysis showed that it would have been cheaper for them to stay on the Detroit water system than it would have been to switch over to the Huron water system. And Detroit would have recouped approximately $750 million over a long-term period of time, i.e. approximately, I believe it was 10 years. They would have gotten approximately $750,000 a year just for being connected to the system, and then whatever the water cost would be. Well, this governor didn't want that to happen because he had Detroit under his thumb, and he didn't want to help Detroit to ease their own financial difficulties. So the plan to stay on the Detroit water system was nixed, and a new plan was created to go onto the Huron water system, and that plan was pushed forward. But I'm going to make a separate video on what went down with that.
Governor Steve Rattner, speaking of Detroit, you have another big problem on your hands, maybe not a health problem, but also of great importance, which is the Detroit school system, which is on the verge of collapse. Way overcrowded classes, teachers who don't want to teach, no money, and a question whether the state has done enough to help Detroit in general, but specifically in this case, whether the state has done enough to help the Detroit school system.
Yes, Steve, I appreciate the question. I think you're very familiar with the great work we've done in the city of Detroit with the city government.
That's bullshit.
The next one on topic was the Detroit education across the board. So last year I proposed a plan, and I'm still working on getting implemented, to essentially make a $700 million investment to deal with the historic debt of the Detroit public schools, also give them resources to make a transition and do some investments. And the issue there is I need legislative support, and I've asked the legislature to do that, and I want to get that done before we have court intervention in the situation.
I want to add.
Now, that's a bunch of bullshit, because if you go back, and I'm not particularly sure of the dates, and I'll clean the dates up when I make the next video, but Detroit school system had put forward a bond of $1.5 billion in order to completely revitalize their school system. It was at the point that the bond was passed and funded that this governor decided to go in and take control of the Detroit school system. It's follow the money. Now, it is true that one of the supervisors within the school system was convicted of corruption, but at the point that he was convicted, the school system was running surpluses in the amount of approximately $400 million. Once the emergency manager took over, that's when the Detroit school system started running deficits. So what he's saying is a bunch of crap, and I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to make a video regarding that.
Ask you just generally, because we're talking about what happened in Flint, the decision that was made to save money because Michigan is so strapped. We talk about what's happening in Detroit right now. Again, a money problem. We've seen what's happened in Detroit over the past 30 years. It's a city that has trouble even keeping its street lights on. Is Detroit, is the state of Michigan at this point, not to sound like John Lindsay, but is it an ungovernable state?
Absolutely not. Actually, we've made tremendous progress statewide, and Detroit is one of the success stories in the country. You're citing old facts, and I invite you to visit Detroit and come see it. Those street lights have come on.
Yeah, the street lights have come on because once they were legally able to come out from underneath the emergency manager, the current mayor of Detroit went out and got financing through Citibank in order to fund public infrastructure. And one of the first things he did was to get all of the lights in Detroit turned back on.
The blight is going down. Trash is being picked up. Public safety is improving. And I've got a good partnership working with the mayor of Detroit. Yeah. This is about the public sector doing a lot of good things in Detroit. And unfortunately, we have this terrible tragedy because of some career civil service experts causing trouble there. We're going to address that. We're going to get that behind us and deal with it in the long term, because people have been harmed. Children have been harmed that can be hurt for years and years. I'm not going to treat this as a short-term crisis. This is a commitment to take care of this as long as I'm in office and put procedures in place to take care of these kids as long as they need help, which could be for decades.
So who authorized the switch for the city of Flint to stop buying water from Detroit?
Here we go.
Was it the emergency manager at the time?
Yeah, in terms of the change itself, it was a broader effort in terms of saying they wanted to change their water system to a new water authority, and it was actually voted for by the city council, and it was ratified by the emergency manager.
And that's a bunch of crap, because yeah, he is right. It was voted for by the city council 7-1. Okay, but they actually had no authority to put it into place. The person who had the authority to put it into place was the previous manager to Darnell Earley. And that agreement was run all the way up to the governor, who signed off on it. And I have a little further commentary I'm going to make at the end of this particular segment, and it looks like I'm going to be making 2 videos on this. But the city council and the mayor were not responsible for this, because in their mind, and I'll address that in a few moments, they were going to continue to stay on the Detroit water system.
7-1 vote of the city council to leave the Detroit water system. The emergency manager ratified it after they made that vote.
And that was a decision to save money, I think, right, Governor?
Well, again, it would also reduce their cost in some ways, but I believe they wanted their independence, and it was a county-wide decision.
Yeah, it is interesting that, and we've been saying it here, this is a decision that was made by local officials.
It was not.
County officials, state officials. You had the Federal Environmental Protection Agency having evidence that they buried. And of course, somebody's lost their job because of it. This is...
when are the people of Flint going to have water?
Yeah,
that they can drink?
I guess that's the best question to finish with.
Yeah, short term, we're making sure they have bottled water and or filters, and we've made an effort with the National Guard. We visited over 30,000 homes. Our estimate was 30,000 homes. We passed that last night. We'll visit another 7,000 homes to work on the short term. Longer term, the big issue is, yeah, we want the water coming out of the tap to be good. Progress is being made in terms of reestablishing corrosive controls. That started December 9th in earnest. But we want to make sure we're careful on that, so extensive testing will be done, and that's something that we need outside experts, the EPA, the city, the county, all of us to come together, but outside experts need to validate that, because I can understand why the citizens of Flint would have high skepticism of government at this point.
Are you going to get that?
Yeah, we absolutely are. We're in the process of making those arrangements now.
So, Governor, this is a question asked, I'll admit, totally in ignorance, but why wouldn't you just in the short run, why wouldn't the people of Flint, Michigan in the short run just switch back to the Detroit water supply?
We did. We actually made that change, but one of the issues is because of the nature of the lack of corrosive controls, it's going to take some time to build up that protection on pipes, like it's true of most cities around the country.
Pipes, okay.
Gosh.
All right,
Disaster.
All right, Governor Rick Snyder, thank you so much.
Now, here's a further follow-up. The Detroit Free Press did an article on this, and they indicated that Flint's decision to sever its ties with the city of Detroit as its supplier of water went all the way to the governor's office. On March 25th, the then State Treasurer Andy Dillon and Governor Rick Snyder's Chief of Staff Dennis Muchmore had a telephone conversation about the Flint water supply alternatives. Later that evening, the Flint City Council, which was under a state-appointed emergency manager, voted 7-1 in favor of a switch in the supply of its water supply from the city of Detroit to a new Kurgandhi Water Authority, a move that would ultimately lead to Flint using the corrosive water. Dillon resigned as treasurer in October of 2013, so he tried to get himself basically out of the loop. But there were a number of telephone conversations that were held regarding this matter, and I'm going to pick this up in a second video.